Hey there, future business analysts, strategists, and managers. I am absolutely thrilled to dive into this explainer with you today. What we're looking at here is essentially your ultimate playbook for navigating the messy, complex, but honestly fascinating ecosystems of modern organizations. If you want to drive real, impactful change in your career, well, understanding this framework is exactly where it all begins. So I want you to think about this for a second. Why do brilliant business strategies fail? Right? You see these massive multi-million-dollar mergers fall apart in the news all the time. But when you actually look at the data, great strategies rarely fail because of bad math or flawed financial models. No way. They fail because they completely ignore the people involved. They ignore the organizational context. At the end of the day, a strategy is literally only as good as the people who have to execute it, authorize it, and, live with its consequences. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. We're going to cover the stakeholder ecosystem, identifying your stakeholders, mapping power and interest, crafting communication strategies, resolving stakeholder conflicts, and finally, achieving strategic alignment. Starting right off with Section 1, the stakeholder ecosystem. Let's lay the groundwork. What actually is a stakeholder? Well, our foundational definition states that stakeholders are any individuals, groups, or organizations that can influence or be influenced by the outcomes of a strategic decision. Notice how incredibly broad that is. As a business analyst, you really have to realize that this goes way beyond just your immediate project team. We are talking about a massive interconnected web of actors spanning economic, social, and political systems. To make sense of this giant web, we can split it into two main categories: internal and external. Internal stakeholders, like your employees, your managers, the executives, they're embedded right within the structure. They directly shape the company's performance, culture, and governance. But you absolutely cannot forget the external players: customers, suppliers, regulators, advocacy groups. They sit outside the organization, sure, but they exert massive influence. Think about environmental regulators imposing new compliance standards that basically force a company into a complete shift toward green policies. You really have to account for both sides of the coin. Moving right along to Section 2, identifying your stakeholders. So how do we actually figure out who these people are? It's definitely not a guessing game. There is a rigorous 3-step methodology: brainstorming, categorization, and validation. And following this structured flow is absolutely crucial because it prevents organizational tunnel vision, making sure you don't miss anyone important. Let's break those 3 steps down. First up, you brainstorm widely. You get your leadership and your subject matter experts into a room, and you list everyone, from shareholders all the way down to local communities. Second, you categorize them into meaningful buckets, like, say, market versus non-market actors, just to clarify their perspectives. Finally, and honestly, this is the step most people skip, you validate. You have to confirm their real systemic importance. Because if you skip validation, you might completely underestimate hidden influencers. Imagine activist investors who suddenly demand sweeping environmental commitments and literally derail your entire strategy while you weren't looking. Yeah, you don't want that. Okay, on to Section 3, mapping power and interest. This brings us to the power/interest grid, which is essentially your ultimate cheat sheet for prioritizing stakeholders. It maps players on 2 really crucial axes. The vertical axis is power, meaning their ability to actually influence or even block organizational decisions. And the horizontal axis is interest, how much they genuinely care about the outcome of your strategy. Now, how you treat a stakeholder depends entirely on where they fall on this grid. Let's look at the extremes for a second. Your high-power, high-interest folks are your key players. Think of them like the professor grading your final thesis, right? You need constant, two-way engagement, co-creation, and deep alignment with them. On the flip side, the low-power, low-interest quadrant contains peripheral groups. You don't ignore them, obviously, but you save your energy and resources by just giving them light-touch monitoring, just in case their status changes in the future. Next up, Section 4, crafting communication strategies. Now, what's really interesting here is that when it comes to communication channels, you absolutely cannot use a one-size-fits-all approach. If you're dealing with a government regulator, you must use formal channels. We're talking compliance reports that offer accountability, traceability, and concrete executive proof. But if a department head is just a little confused about a new data assumption, an informal ping on instant messaging is perfect for real-time clarification. And for broad, inclusive reach to your customers or a widespread employee base, digital channels like newsletters and intranets are your best bet. You've got to match the channel to the audience. That brings us to Section 5, resolving stakeholder conflicts. So why do people fight in organizations? Conflict is inevitable, and usually it boils down to a few core sources. The biggest one is divergent interests. Picture this. Executives want an aggressive cost-cutting strategy to boost profitability, right? But the employees are terrified of layoffs and just want job security. Boom, instant conflict. You also see fights over scarce resources, like budget allocations, or clashes driven by cultural and subcultural differences. I mean, the finance team communicates and thinks fundamentally differently than the marketing team. It happens all the time. When these conflicts inevitably hit, you have an escalation path of resolution techniques. You might start with negotiation to find some common ground. If there's a serious power imbalance, well, you bring in mediation with a neutral third party. But the absolute gold standard you should always aim for is collaboration. This is where you actually co-create solutions, transforming that conflict into pure innovation. If time is tight, though, you might just have to settle for compromise, where both sides concede some demands just to prevent a gridlock and keep the strategy moving forward.
And finally, Section 6, Achieving Strategic Alignment.
So the crucial point here is perfectly captured by this quote from the source material. Alignment transforms potential friction into synergy. See, when you align stakeholder needs with your organizational goals, you aren't just making people happy. You are securing active support, you're unlocking funding, and you're gaining the legitimacy required to make your initiatives actually survive and thrive in the real world. But how do we systematically achieve this? We use a highly practical tool called the Balanced Scorecard. It's basically a 4-step process. You identify your groups, and then, and this is the magic part, you translate their abstract expectations into measurable key performance indicators, or KPIs. So instead of a vague goal like, hey, let's make customers happy, you translate that into tracking a specific Net Promoter Score. Then you categorize those KPIs and set realistic targets. These KPIs are then sorted into the 4 perspectives of a balanced scorecard: financial, customer, internal processes, and learning and growth. Now, why do this? Well, because it physically prevents a company from getting tunnel vision and obsessing only over short-term financial gains. By tracking all 4 buckets, you prove to your stakeholders that long-term sustainability, efficient processes, and employee growth matter exactly as much as the bottom line. Which brings us to our final question for today. Are you ready to be a change agent? You now have the playbook. The business world doesn't just need people who can run the numbers. It desperately needs leaders who can navigate the human ecosystem. So, I want you to look at your own upcoming projects or your current teams and ask yourself, who is the hidden stakeholder you've been ignoring? And what happens to your entire strategy if they suddenly decide to say no? Think about that. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.